Earl Madsen was the kind of man no one noticed quiet, polite, the one who fixed engines and waved at neighbors without ever meeting their eyes. But when the bodies started appearing in the woods surrounding Pine Hollow, carved with strange symbols and laid out like some ritual, everyone realized too late that Earl had been watching them all along. Pine Hollow, Arkansas, was the kind of place people drove through without noticing. A few gas stations, a diner with faded red booths, a church steeple that rang every Sunday morning. The air always smelled like pine and sawdust from the local mill, and life moved at an easy, predictable pace. Neighbors waved at each other from pickup trucks, and folks left their doors unlocked without a second thought. For generations, nothing much had changed until the summer that shattered everything. It started on a sweltering July morning when a hunter named Carl Benton ventured into the woods before sunrise. He was after deer, following a familiar trail about 5 miles from town. But what he found instead made him stumble backward in shock. 3 bodies lay among the ferns and pine needles, arranged carefully in a triangle. Their faces were pale and peaceful, as if someone had placed them there deliberately. The silence of the forest felt heavy, almost watching. Carl ran until his lungs burned, speeding straight to the sheriff's office. By the time deputies arrived, the sun was rising, sending streaks of gold through the trees. The scene was worse than anyone expected. Each victim had something carved into the tree beside them, an X inside a circle, etched deep into the bark. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle. It looked like the killer had vanished into thin air. The victims were identified by afternoon. One was a beloved school teacher named Linda Harris, known for her warm smile and Sunday bake sales. Another was Frank Doyle, a truck driver who'd spent most of his life hauling timber for the mill. The third was Jamie Parker, a college student visiting her parents during summer break. None of them knew each other, and their lives had never crossed. That baffled investigators. There was no link, no reason for them to die together in the same patch of woods. As word spread, fear took root in Pine Hollow. Families kept their kids close. The diner closed early. The usual laughter that filled the gas station on Friday nights turned to hushed whispers. The sheriff, a man named Tom Riggins, held press conferences on the courthouse steps, assuring everyone that help was coming. The Arkansas State Police soon joined the investigation, setting up tents and floodlights near the crime scene. Reporters from Little Rock filled the tiny town square, their cameras flashing in the humid air. But despite the attention, nothing made sense. The coroner confirmed the victims had all died the same way, but the method was kept from the public. The strange symbol became the center of every conversation. Some said it was satanic. Others thought it was a mark from an old logging crew. Conspiracy theories flooded social media, but none of them fit. At night, the woods that once felt safe turned sinister. Dogs barked at shadows, and hunters swore they saw lights flickering deep among the trees. People began locking their doors for the first time in years, while the sheriff's patrol cars roamed the dark backroads with headlights cutting through mist. The murders had come out of nowhere, and the town that once prided itself on peace suddenly found itself trapped in fear. Something evil had arrived in Pine Hollow, and it didn't seem in any hurry to leave. As summer stretched on, the investigation into the Pine Hollow murders deepened, but answers remained painfully out of reach. Weeks had passed since the discovery of the first victims, and the once bustling command post now buzzed with frustration. Detectives sifted through files and maps, tracing every path in the woods, every known hiking route, and every dirt road that cut through the pine forest. Nothing pointed to a clear suspect. What they did have was a pattern subtle, chilling, and unmistakable. Each new crime scene followed a route that seemed to circle the town, as though someone was slowly closing in on it. When the 4th body was found, the entire state took notice. This time, the victim was discovered along a quiet back road near the Washita River. Like before, there were no tire marks, no discarded items, no struggle. Just the same symbol carved into a tree. The killer was careful and methodical, moving through the forest like he belonged there. He left behind no trace of himself, almost as if he was invisible. The news called him the Arkansas's woodsman, a name that soon stuck. Investigators noticed something strange about the killings. Each body was found near an old logging site, places abandoned decades ago when the mill scaled down. Those sites were isolated, surrounded by thick brush, and nearly impossible to reach without knowing the land. Whoever was doing this understood every inch of those woods. That detail narrowed the list of suspects to locals, mostly men who had worked in logging or hunting for years. The break the detectives desperately needed came unexpectedly. A young deputy searching one of the crime scenes noticed a scrap of blue fabric tangled on a low branch. At first, it seemed insignificant, just a torn piece of cloth, but the lab results told another story. The fabric came from a work jacket made exclusively for employees at the Pine Hollow lumber mill. It was a small lead, but in a case built on silence, it was something. Officers began visiting the mill, interviewing workers during their lunch breaks. Most were cooperative but nervous, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid the killer might be among them. One name came up more than once: Earl Madsen. He was a quiet mechanic who kept to himself, known for spending his breaks carving bits of wood with a pocket knife. No one ever thought much of it, but now, with the strange symbols appearing at crime scenes, that habit drew attention. Detectives looked into Earl's background and found little to go on. He had no criminal record, no close family, and no online presence. He lived alone in a weather-beaten trailer on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and old machinery. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who preferred the company of the woods over people. By the time police decided to visit him, Earl had already vanished. His trailer sat quiet under the shade of pine branches, the door locked from the outside. Inside, investigators found a layer of dust and a single map tacked to the wall with red circles drawn across it. Each circle matched the location of a murder. That was when the truth began to take shape. The killer wasn't an outsider passing through. He was one of their own, someone who had walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, and waved at the same neighbors. The realization chilled Pine Hollow to its core. The hunt for Earl Madsen had officially begun, and the peaceful town that once feared the woods now knew its darkest secrets were hiding within them. When officers arrived at Earl Madsen's property, the forest around his trailer was so quiet that every footstep seemed to echo. The small clearing was littered with rusted tools, stacks of firewood, and old tires half buried in weeds. The place looked abandoned, but the ash in the fire pit was still warm. That meant he had been there recently. The deputies spread out carefully, checking the shed, the truck parked out front, and the thick brush behind the trailer. There was no sign of Earl anywhere. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and dust. The trailer's walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of nails, broken parts, and small carvings of trees and animals. At first glance, it looked like the workshop of a lonely craftsman. But on closer inspection, the deputies noticed something unsettling. Every carving had the same mark hidden somewhere, a tiny X inside a circle burned into the wood. On the kitchen table lay a stack of maps. They were hand-marked with circles, dates, and rough notes written in a shaky script. Each marked spot matched the exact locations of the murders. In a drawer, officers found a box of Polaroid photos. The pictures showed forest scenes, but not the kind that tourists take. These were images of the murder sites taken before the police had ever found them. The trees, the bodies, even the symbols, it was all there. Earl had photographed his own crimes. The more they searched, the darker the discoveries became. Behind the trailer, hidden beneath a tarp, was a wooden crate filled with journals. The earliest entries were ordinary lists of repairs, mentions of the weather, and brief notes about working at the mill. Then the writing shifted. The later pages were filled with rambling passages about cleansing the land, removing corruption, and returning the forest to silence. It was clear Earl believed he was on some kind of mission. The tone of his words wasn't angry. It was calm, almost proud. Investigators pieced together his life story. Earl had grown up in Pine Hollow, the son of a logger who died when Earl was young. He had dropped out of high school, worked odd jobs, and spent most of his time alone in the woods. Neighbors remembered him as quiet but helpful, the kind of man who fixed your fence without being asked. No one had ever suspected what he was capable of. Forensics teams found traces of soil and plant matter on Earl's boots that matched several of the crime scenes. There was enough evidence to issue a warrant, but Earl was gone. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. Rumors spread fast through town. Some said he had fled across state lines. Others whispered he was still hiding among the trees, watching the search teams move through his territory. The sheriff's office received reports of strange sightings, lights flickering deep in the woods, footprints appearing near rivers, the sound of someone chopping wood long after midnight. Despite the fear, one thing became clear. Earl Madsen knew those forests better than anyone. He could disappear into them for weeks, maybe months. To catch him, law enforcement would have to think like him, move like him, and enter the same dark wilderness he called home. The discovery of his journals confirmed what everyone now feared. This wasn't random violence, it was a belief system, a twisted mission carried out by a man who thought the forest had chosen him. And while the police gathered their evidence and planned their search, Earl was already out there somewhere, watching and waiting for his next move. The manhunt for Earl Madsen began before dawn, when fog still hung low over the pines. Dozens of officers gathered near the edge of the forest, armed with maps, flashlights, and radios that crackled through the static. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the gray mist while dogs barked and strained against their leashes. The woods stretched endlessly, thick with shadows and winding trails that twisted back on themselves. It was a perfect hiding place for someone who knew it better than anyone else. Earl had grown up exploring those very woods. He knew which creeks stayed dry, where the ground sank beneath the roots, and how to travel without leaving a trace. Every path the search teams followed seemed to fade into nothing. For days, they combed through miles of dense undergrowth, finding only signs that he had passed through a campfire still warm, a half-eaten can of beans, a footprint washed by rain. He was always one step ahead, watching them from somewhere unseen. The tension among the officers was thick. Days blended together as they fought through mud, mosquitoes, and exhaustion. Locals joined in, volunteering their time, though most were terrified. Some refused to enter the woods at all, convinced Earl was haunting the place like a spirit. The sheriff's voice grew hoarse from long hours on the radio, calling in updates that all sounded the same: nothing yet, keep searching. On the seventh day, a farmer named Henry Walsh called the police. He lived about 15 miles outside of Pine Hollow, on the edge of the national forest. That morning, he found 2 of his goats missing and a set of muddy footprints leading to his barn. When officers arrived, they discovered a small pile of ashes where someone had built a fire behind the property. Beside it lay a torn piece of fabric from the same blue work jacket linked to the earlier crimes. Earl had been there, maybe just hours before. The search shifted south toward the river, where the terrain turned rough and overgrown. Drones were sent in to scan the tree canopy, and tracking dogs were flown in from neighboring counties. The forest echoed with the hum of engines and the calls of searches moving through the brush. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the weather changed. A heavy storm rolled in without warning, bringing sheets of rain and howling winds that drowned out the sound of engines. The floodlights flickered and went dark, and for the first time, the teams were forced to pull back. When morning came, the storm had left the ground soaked and littered with fallen branches. But the rain had done more than make things difficult. It had revealed something. Near the old sawmill, a patrol found deep boot prints leading up a hill and stopping near a small cave entrance. Inside, they found remnants of another camp. A crude bed of pine needles, empty cans, and a small carving knife. On the cave wall, the familiar X inside a circle had been scratched into the stone. It was proof that Earl was close. He wasn't fleeing across the country like some had feared. He He was circling back, staying within reach of the town, hiding among the same trees he once walked as a worker. That night, as darkness settled over Pine Hollow again, a state trooper patrolling the forest's edge saw something flicker between the trees. A faint orange glow deep in the distance. It wasn't lightning, and it wasn't a campfire from any of the search teams. The officers moved quietly toward the light, hearts pounding, radios silent. After 10 days of chasing shadows, they were about to face the man the whole state had been hunting. The glow flickered faintly through the trees, a warm orange pulse against the endless dark. The officers advanced slowly, boots sinking into wet leaves, every branch creak echoing like thunder in the quiet woods. The night air smelled of smoke and damp pine. As they drew closer, the light grew brighter until they could see it clearly, a small campfire burning in a clearing, flames licking at the air like it had been tended carefully. Sitting beside it was a man, his back to them, motionless except for the steady rhythm of his hand carving into a piece of wood. The officers fanned out silently, flashlights switched off, their movements deliberate and slow. When they were close enough to see his face, they knew it was him. Earl Madsen looked calm, almost peaceful, his clothes soaked from rain and streaked with mud. His beard had grown wild, and his eyes reflected the fire's light with an empty, faraway look. Around him lay small carvings scattered in the dirt, each bearing the same circular symbol. The forest, which had felt so alive with fear, seemed to hold its breath. When they finally surrounded him, Earl didn't run, he didn't even turn at first. He just placed the carving knife beside the fire and stared into the flames, as if waiting for something only he understood. The lead officer stepped forward and called out his name. Slowly, Earl rose to his feet and lifted his hands. In that moment, the entire manhunt ended, not with a chase, but with silence. The search teams moved in and restrained him, finding a folded piece of paper in his pocket. Inside was a list of names, residents of Pine Hollow, some already dead, others still alive. No one knew how he chose them or what they meant to him. At the bottom of the page, the last line read, "The forest decides who stays." Back at the station, investigators questioned him for hours. Earl sat still, barely blinking, his hands resting on the table. He answered almost nothing, giving only short, cryptic phrases when he spoke at all. The one thing he repeated was that the woods had called him. To him, the murders weren't crimes, they were offerings, part of a twisted belief that he was cleansing the land of people who didn't belong. His calmness made it even more unnerving. The evidence from his trailer, his journals, and the photographs left no doubt. Earl Madsen was found guilty on multiple counts of murder. The trial drew crowds from across the state, each day filled with whispers and tension. Survivors of victims sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers, all trying to understand how someone so ordinary could commit something so monstrous. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliver a unanimous verdict. Earl showed no emotion when the sentence was read life in prison without parole. When the case finally ended, Pine Hollow tried to heal, but the scars remained. The forest that once gave the town its peace now carried an uneasy silence. Even years later, hunters claimed to see carvings on trees deep in the woods, fresh symbols etched into the bark. No one ever saw who made them, but they always looked the same. Some said it was vandals keeping the legend alive, others believed the forest hadn't forgotten Earl. At night, when the wind moved through the trees, it sometimes sounded like whispers, faint and restless, as if the land itself was telling a story that no one wanted to hear again.